Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. We are very excited to have this number attending our event today. First of all, let me start by introducing myself. My name is Samer Fawadla. I'm the General Manager of Sales for Levant and Africa in Eastnets. You can see me on the video, I believe now, and you can see the handsome guy on the slide on the right. This is me. In this webinar, we and Trustlink, our strategic partner in South Africa, are happy and delighted to share with you a lot of information about an important and mandatory topic that we have all to comply with in 2022. This topic is the CSP 2022. From advisory to mandatory controls. Our great speakers we have today, let me start by introducing Louise Johnson. She's the manager of SWIFT business unit at Trustlink South Africa. Most of you already knows her. We are just the new faces, and also Mr. Atala Nejme, my colleague in Eastnets. He's the product development team leader specialized in our anti-fraud solution. So today, under this partnership, under this topic, we'll start with Louise Johnson in her presentation, and then with my colleague Atala Nejme. But before we start with Louise, I would like to inform you about two important points. If you have any questions, please submit your question on the questions box at your right-hand side, and we will discuss the questions at the end of the webinar and answer them. One important thing also, the recording of this webinar will be available after the webinar and will be shared with you all. Thank you very much. I'm handing over to Louise. Louise, please.
Thank you, Samer. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this webinar with us. Like Samer introduced, we established a partnership. And I will just give you a quick overview on Trustlink. You all know us already. You've been using our bureau for some shorter and some longer time. So we've established our bureau in 2002, which means we've been in business for 20 years, providing connectivity to banks across Africa into the SWIFT network. And over the years, we've added and onboarded more value-added services to make the value proposition to you as our customer better. So these value-added services include a filtering solution whereby we screen your transactions against sanctions lists. We have a SWIFT message search and archive depository where you can also pull regulatory reports. We have a module for internal alert and external customer notification. For instance, when a customer account is credited, an email can be triggered to that customer to notify them of this. And then also we can assist you to automate your universal confirmations into the basic tracker, which is a requirement from SWIFT. Atala, next slide, please. Okay, so the Trustlink methodology is that we partner with the best of breed solution providers. And as Samer mentioned, we established a partnership in 2021. And since then, we have implemented Eastnets payment guard solution to provide this as a fully managed and hosted solution to you as our customers. So it brings me to, okay, next slide, please, Atala. It brings me to the CSP. Now, this CSP program has now been running for 5 years, and it is a result of the hack that was at the Central Bank of Bangladesh in February in 2016. So during the investigation of what and how this happened, it became clear to SWIFT that they actually had to put in place a customer security control framework to ensure that everyone that connects into the SWIFT network, their environment and their connection into SWIFT is as secure as possible. So hackers do not discriminate against who they target. They go after one thing, and that is monetary value. Now, the CSP framework is built on 3 objectives, which is to secure your environment, know and limit your access, and to detect and respond accordingly. Next slide, please, Atala. Okay, so here with the changes in the control framework for 2022, most importantly, it's Control 2.9, which is the transaction business controls, which has been promoted from advisory to mandatory. Then we've got Control 1.5A, which is a new advisory control for Architecture A4, and all our customers that connect via our bureau are on the Architecture A4 type. Then Control 6.2, software integrity, and then also database integrity became advisory for Architecture A4. And then Control 1.2 is extended in an advisory role. So this is now bringing me to why we're having this webinar. And Atala is going to take us through the requirements that are listed within this Control 2.9. And how we, in our partnership with Eastnets, can assist you become compliant with this new mandatory control for 2002. So thank you very much, and over to you, Atala.
Thank you, Louise, for the introduction and the details provided for the CSP and the updates for 2022. Moving forward with our presentation, we will be first. Let me introduce ourselves, Eastnets, as a company. Eastnets have been there in the market for the past 20 years at least. We are providing services and products that touches on various areas of the compliance, security, and transaction processing, starting from the middleware for payments and transactions to data warehousing, as well as compliance solutions that is covering areas like watchlist screening, transaction monitoring, KYC, fraud, and trade finance. Now, our customers are spread around the world. We have customers in approximately 120 countries. We have 22 managing partners, as well as over 750 financial institutions as clients, which brings a lot of, I would say, experience and acumen, even within the products that we deliver to our customers. Moving forward to the topic of the updates for customer security program for year 2022, one of the major aspects that will be taken into account during this year assessment and attestation would be the section 2.9, as highlighted by Luis. This is becoming a mandatory section starting from this year, unlike other previous years where it was only advisory. And in order to summarize the required actions and controls that has to be in place in order to comply, and even further to compliance, we are here talking about implementing controls that would ultimately protect organizations from any potential fraud scenario that might happen, apart from the compliance with SWIFT requirements noted under section 2.9. Now, section 2.9 refers to the transaction business control, and over the past few years, this part of the requirements has proven its effectiveness in, I would say, mitigating the risks that would involve cases that have been seen before, starting from the event that took place on 2016 and all the subsequent events that happened in later years. For such, this particular section will be required for all architecture types and will be part of the attestation and assessment, which is required for this year, starting from the second half of 2022. Now, to summarize the requirement that is within section 2.9, we have built a list of 7 different requirements that we will be talking about each one of them separately, and how our solution, Payment Guard, would ultimately provide you with the ability to cover those requirements in addition to many other controls that can be implemented. Starting from limiting traffic outside business hours to the limiting the amounts for normal business ranges, the confirmation checks and reconciliation of statement messages, reconciling daily traffic between back office applications or systems with the whatever is going towards the network, and performing the central checks to spot any abnormal behavior, and finally with the integrity and session gaps that will indicate some events that took place that might be a suspicious event and of a high risk nature. Starting from the first requirement, when we talk about the traffic and versus the business hours, basically here we are talking about the normal hours that any financial institutions would operate in. Some institutions might operate in a certain time frame when it comes to SWIFT traffic, like for example 8-hour window or so, and other institutions will simply operate 24/7 or 24/5. This will differ based on the region, the jurisdiction of that particular institution, and the nature of the operation and business they are conducting, for which it is usually seen and recognized that attacks, whenever it happens, any fraudster would try to inject, for example, fraudulent transactions. They would target certain time during the operation window, which will make it much harder for the institution to detect and respond to such case. Example of that would be to initiate an attack or inject fraudulent messages, initiate transactions during the last few minutes of the session for that particular day, especially when it's followed by a long holiday like a day or two or a weekend. That will even make it harder for the institution to detect and respond to such case, for which there are lots of controls that can be in scope, like for example rigidly defining the calendars for the working hours and users, and to limit the access for certain time frame for each user or group of users. But as we mentioned, for this particular requirement, there would be some financial institutions who would not follow an exact time frame for their operation, and for which there should be a higher level of a control that will override or work hand in hand with the conventional calendar-based or schedule-based controls that will learn from the data that you have about your users, the usual working hours, the transaction usual hours, and that would be basically based on machine learning as an AI model. And in this case, we might mention that examples of the working hours for transactions, for example, whenever your institution is processing a certain type of transaction, like transactions towards your correspondent in US dollars, that would not happen ideally around the clock. Mostly you will be doing that in a certain time frame, and anything that outside of this time frame would be considered as unusual and highly suspicious in this particular case. Similarly, certain users will operate in certain time frames and others will operate in other time frames, and some users might have access that is not bounded by a time frame, but they are doing work in an unusual hour, and this is also something that should be covered as well. Moving towards the amounts and range of amounts when it comes to the normal business ranges, there are lots of aspects for this particular requirement, starting by the simplest scenario that we can think of, which is the amount threshold. When it comes to amount threshold, here in this particular case, we are limiting, or not limiting, we are monitoring, I would say, the traffic whenever it exceeds or the amount basically is higher than a certain threshold, and that can be applicable for certain currencies or certain correspondents or countries, or even certain, I would say, channels. In this particular case, scenarios can be defined that will monitor each and every transaction, and whenever the transaction exceeds that particular threshold based on the scenario, say for example the correspondence, where I usually send transactions up to a certain amount, and whenever I exceed with a particular transaction, this should be detected and an action item should be processed. either we suspend that particular transaction until somebody is clearing it out, or even just to report it and warn about it. And that brings us to the concept of the amount and range when it comes to accumulation over a certain time frame, say a day, few hours or so. And that is a higher level, I would say, of a control that will look on aggregations based on currency as well. Again, currency, correspondent country, so on and so forth. And whenever the aggregations is exceeding in the set scenario, the models will basically warn and report that particular transaction, and actions as well should be taken. That part is basically the first 2 points that I described here. Basically, this just acts on the amounts and ensures that versus different logics, different components, different perspectives, those aggregations and thresholds are being monitored, and controls are in place whenever the scenario requires that the model should intervene and act on it, enabling users to see and monitor and act on those particular transactions. And furthermore, anomalies in the amounts also should be detected. And this is basically, again, we are implementing the AI logic here to detect anomalies. Like, for example, one of the models that we have, and we will come to examples in the next slides, is the exponential decay, where, for example, in a certain time frame, each correspondent and currency and customer, so on and so forth, can be monitored. And whenever the traffic that is targeted towards one of those channels is exceeding the normal amount ranges for business, the scenario will inform you, will detect, and will respond to that particular case. And this is also combined with the ability to forecast traffic. As we all know, the business is on constant growth, and whenever we are checking, we need to take into account not only the data that we set as threshold, but also the growth that is expected and what is normal in terms of business growth. And that is particularly what the AI is providing us for the ability to forecast aggregations or single transaction on currency level and correspondent level, so on and so forth. And finally, the statistical approach, which is basically models that will link directly to your data, overfitted towards your data, and will detect the deviation from that particular pattern. And that would be also something that will work in combination of all the other three different types of controls that we described. Next, we have the requirements that states the check of confirmation messages. So those particular types of messages, like the MT900, MT910, those should be cross-checked against the traffic, the outward messages ideally. And whenever you receive a transaction that does not link to a particular transaction that was previously seen, that is a red flag. And this is considered as a direct control that should be applicable for all payment or transaction that relates to payment messages. So the idea here is simple. We just cross-check against the seen traffic, the known traffic, and whenever the confirmation, as soon as the confirmation is received from the network, from SWIFT. The same would also happen when we receive where financial institutions receive the statement messages. All underlying transactions should be cross-checked as well with the known transactions, and any transaction that does not comply or does not check with the known transactions. So that indicates that some transactions, or one at least transaction or more, was injected without at race. And this is also something that the system will have to warn about. And covering this requirement means that as soon as this is detected, you will need to be warned about it. Next, we have in the same also category, we have the reconciliation of daily traffic. And in this particular case, the daily traffic that have been outbounded from your side towards the network will have to reconcile against the transactions that was published from your backend. And we will come to that particular point in a bit later on in our slide. Next, we have the central checks, and the central checks target is basically to discover anomalies or abnormal behaviors, and that can come in different shapes or forms. For example, any transaction that is exceeding the normal pattern for a certain correspondent or currency, or has an operational characteristics that does not follow the exact pattern that is expected to have on a certain type of transaction. This particular case would be considered abnormal. Example of that would be if I have a customer, or I have I would say an operational method that would dictate that no manual intervention should be occurring on a SWIFT alliance level, for example. And I have a message that was processed manually, created, moved, disposed. This is a direct indication of an abnormal behavior, and that particular message has to be suspended. Another example would be to tackle the amount ranges, which brings us back to requirement number 2. Characteristics like the currency, correspondent, message type, country, so on and so forth, is also considered within the validation of transactions, and the models will have to respond to that particular abnormal behavior in terms of the workflow and what would happen if such is detected. The discussion about this particular section is long. I will mention a few examples later on that will also relate to those particular this particular control. And finally, we have the tracking of session numbers, and in this particular case, we are referring to the session numbers and any integrity gap that will indicate a red flag. And for this particular control, this is a direct control. Any discrepancy or any gap in the session IDs would indicate a problem in the environment. And in this case, this has to be warned about and responded to as soon as it's known. And this will maybe in certain cases protect or help to reduce the financial loss that would happen in case of a cyber attack that involved, for example, SWIFT interface. And this was the case for several attacks that happened in previous years against financial institutions. Now, to get on a high level, if we want to categorize the fraud cases, we start with the first and most obvious type or category. The fraud cases or fraud transactions that is injected directly into financial institution. And in this particular group, we are referring to injecting the transactions directly into the messaging system through the messaging interface. In this particular category, it's always the case that this might involve a cyber attack, either externally or some type of fraud directed towards the messaging system directly internally. In both cases, the usual pattern that is seen throughout the years that such case will start by compromising the environment, then gaining access to the messaging interface, injecting the fraudulent message or messages. Then the fraudster would basically try to hide evidences by destroying the environment or deleting those particular transactions. There are many ways that they utilize to hide evidences, and later on the discovery of the fraud case, which can be 1 hour later, 1 day later, or even few days later if we are talking about a window of a holiday that is right after or before a weekend. The second type or category is the fraud initiated from client end, and basically a couple of examples about this particular type is the identity theft or app fraud with false payments, or invoices or any other type of scams. And those are basically initiated from client end. So we are talking directly a fraud case that is happening directly at the client end, maybe from their mobile device, maybe by hijacking their account, so on and so forth. Now, as an overview about Payment Guard is a real-time fraud detection solution. This particular solution is built around a robust modeling engine that will enable its users to execute complicated scenarios and to achieve the required validation throughout the models, the scenarios, the adaptation of learning with the AI models, and other features that will help with reducing the friction of the validation that is being executed. So overall, this will enable our clients, Payment Guard users, to intercept suspicious payments and suspicious events in real time, to be able to detect those, to respond to them throughout the detection and alert management processes. And all this happens according to a customized logic that would fit your need, that would fit the requirements. Maybe in this particular case, we are talking about CSP, but other models can also cover different types of requirements that would enable you also to detect other types of fraud. And all that is also controlled within the tracking and reporting mechanisms that we provide under our solution. As a brief note, benefits of using Payment Guard can be summarized as follows. Payment Guard is a real-time detection and prevention solution that will enable you to detect, respond ASAP to any particular fraud or suspicious case, which will ultimately reduce the fraud losses. Payment Guard enable you to build scenarios that multi-channel and cross-channel, and in this particular scenario, we are talking about the execution against multiple sources like SWIFT, like core banking, like e-banking, so on and so forth. So those are two covered in a different way that we call multi-channel and cross-channel, and we will be explaining a bit about those in the coming slides. Models are mostly built on AI, and those are self-adapting models that will reduce the effort for you to adapt the thresholds, the parameters, the logic of the scenario and model to your particular case and data to fit and be able to detect according to the particular requirements. So all of this is being reduced by utilizing self-adapting models. Also, the investigation process that is fully supported with the business intelligence and the link analysis models that will enable you to constantly monitor and analyze the detections and the cases that the system will generate, which represents suspicious events or suspicious payments or transactions that is being dealt with. And that will enable you to achieve a high fraud detection rate, keeping the low rate of false positives, which is the ideal scenario. Next, we will be talking about the models. As we mentioned, models are built differently. We have models that is directed towards a certain channel, like, for example, the workflow that is implemented on SWIFT, and other models that will be utilizing the data from different sources. Multi-channel models is basically models that can be implemented on different channels with different characteristics and parameterization and customization. And cross-channel are models that can act on data from different sources altogether, combining the logic. For example, if you have a system that will initiate transactions and then you have another system that will generate another transaction based on the first transaction, you can combine data from both systems to generate alerts based on dual logic.
Atallah, sorry to interrupt you, but the slide we can see is out of presentation mode. It's also the first slide. So yeah,
apologies.
now.
Now you can see the slides?
No, you need to go back.
Okay.
Atal, if you want, unshare and share again.
I just did unshare again. Did it work?
We see the PowerPoint file open and the first
Yeah,
screen
now
it
it's
works. Yes, you can go down to the slide you want. Thank you.
Okay. Now it works, Dalia?
yes, now it works. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And moving forward from the model's logic, this enables us to build orchestral scenarios. This is what we call them, and those basically are scenarios that combine different scenarios together, evaluating the transaction from different aspects to achieve the transaction risk analysis. And each scenario can have different logic. It assigns a risk level for each from a different point of view, and those are combined together with a single output that will represent the transaction risk analysis. And that basically enables you to tune and to respond based on a calculated risk, either low, medium, high, and so on and so forth. When it comes to qualifying the traffic and verifying the authenticity of the traffic, the payment guard solution provides you with the ability to integrate directly with back office systems to cross-check traffic without even the need to have a daily check. Or everything can happen in real time. So if I have, for example, payment guard integrated directly with SWIFT Alliance, I can link payment guard back to my core banking. And whenever a transaction is submitted through the SWIFT Alliance, for instance, payment guard can act on it and check it back, cross-check it back with the back office to verify the authenticity of that particular transaction. And this can happen towards any system, not necessarily a certain type of payment hub or a core solution or even e-banking solutions. So the approach in general for mitigation levels when it comes to harnessing the SWIFT environment is to be able to intercept in real time before network, to be able to keep up with the updates that is being injected from network, like, for example, the network acts, the notifications for debit and credit, the statement messages that we discussed throughout the requirements, and so on and so forth. And those are samples of the models that we provide in Payment Guard to detect several different scenarios that would represent suspicious cases, starting by the operational aspect for SWIFT, for example, when we monitor the manual creation and authorization or manipulated messages, deleted, or any message that was routed with an unusual or unpermitted sequence, like, for example, directly disposing a certain message in a certain queue, which is not permitted, for example, creation of a message partner, or even the manipulation of a certain message. All of this aspect can be monitored by Payment Guard, and all the interventions that are on the messages are constantly being evaluated for each transaction. Other aspects can be coming from the nature of the business, and and this refers back to the points like number 2 and number 5, where we are limiting or monitoring abnormal behavior or business amounts and normal ranges. Structured payments, and this is not structured payments from the aspect of money laundering. Here we are talking about a fraud case that would happen in a much smaller time frame, as well as the statement reconciliation of notifications, the usage of unusual corridors, middle banks, or even an obsolete correspondent can also be detected through a specific model that we provide for that purpose. And also the unusual behavior, which covers different aspects of the transaction from characteristics point of view, like the aggregated amounts, the beneficiary bank, the number of transactions, so on and so forth. And finally, samples of the first requirement, which is the working hours, where we are constantly monitoring the and learning from the data what would be considered as a normal hour for a certain transaction and what would not be considered as a normal hour, apart from the calendar that is also supported by our solution. In this particular case, we are targeting a very tight-fitted specific control that is based on the data. Merely, I would say the data would represent the actual flow, which might not be represented by a normal calendar. And finally, we end up with the ability to monitor, to report with the intuitive dashboards that we provide. Those are dashboards that come in two flavors. The first flavor is the prefix, which describes the transactions, the flow, and enables you to keep monitoring those data in a dashboard form in real time. And also, in another flavor, the dashboard provides you with the ability to build your own dashboards and to be able to report on specific things that are of concern to your institution to keep up to date with. And also the link analysis that is assessing the violations and detections for certain scenarios, and enables the investigator to easily identify patterns, identify links, accounts, and links everything basically together, which will make it easier to investigate certain cases that relate to certain scenarios. And when it comes to the friction that will be caused by fraud detection, in general, this is something that we take into account. We provide several mechanisms that can be utilized to reduce friction, which can be an important part of the whole transaction processing flow. Starting by the score of transaction, which enables you to set your scenarios according to certain logic, as we described, for example, the orchestral scenarios, and to assign a risk level for each transaction, enabling you to implement basically your risk appetite and the way that you implement the policies that you have and the way that you would like to deal with those transactions based on the risk. So scoring of transaction will enable you to identify what is a high risk and what is a low risk, and to act based on a known scoring and a known risk level. In addition to that, payment guard models and scenarios can act in a blocking and non-blocking mode, so you can choose to only warn about certain case based on a certain scenario, or even to block that transaction or suspend it until the detection related to it is resolved, as well as the ability to auto-block transactions in certain scenarios. And those are scenarios that are extremely high risk, that involve, for example, accounts that is known to do fraud, so on and so forth. So auto-block enables you to automatically, without intervention from any user or officer, to block transactions. And next, for transactions that are initiated, for example, from customer end, those transactions can be subject to customer challenging. And in this particular case, Payment Guard will integrate with third-party channels, for example, the SMS gateway, in order to provide a secondary authentication method for that particular user to verify the authenticity of the transaction and to basically verify that the user, intended client, is the one who initiated that particular transaction, utilizing a third channel. And all of this can act all together before finally reaching to the manual investigation process that will require users to review those particular alerts and act on them accordingly. Overall, this will enable you to customize the flows, to build your own logic scenarios, and build the controls that will ensure the protection of your institution, as well as the fulfillment of requirements from different regulators like SWIFT. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you all for attending our session today. And I believe, Tamer, we will be moving now to the Q&A section, right?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Atallah. Thank you, Louise, for such an interesting presentations. Before moving to the questions, I have a couple of questions by our attendees. But before that, to wrap up, so CSP 2022 is different than CSP 2021. So as Louise said, Section 2.9, which is the transaction business control, is mandatory. Every year, as we know, we were relying on Trustlink to provide us with a CSP compliant infrastructure or data center, which is true also in 2022. But there is some additional layer that has to be taken by the banks in 2022 to comply with this CSP Section 2.9 as described by Louisa. Moving to the questions. Okay, I have 5 or 6 questions. The first question, I will take it, Atallah. Is the solution certified by SWIFT? The answer is yes, it's a certified solution. It's a SWIFT certified solution. How can Trustlink help here? Okay, as we said, Louise, would you like to take this question?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so our Trustlink announcement is just reach out to us. We can discuss the solutions further. If there's any additional questions coming out, we can provide you with a proposal, what the projected project plan will look like. So really just reach out to our team and let's engage in the discussions further.
Thank you, Louise. And just to shed some light on our strategic partnership with Trustlink, this payment guard solution is already implemented and live in the Trustlink service group, and you can subscribe to it to comply with the CSP. I'm sure that Trustlink team will be in a better position to help you in this and to provide you with whatever needed to comply. Another question to Atallah. Can you please explain machine learning of events in payment guard / access rights?
Can you repeat the question, please, Tamer? Can you
explain machine learning of events in payment guard access rights? I think he means user access from authentication. And
now, whenever it comes to machine learning, we are targeting our models towards the particular type of data. Some models will act on payments and extract features of those payments over time, over a large set of data, and learn from it. Similarly, those can also be done to events. The login is an event. The failed login is another event, and extracting features from those events can also enable us to process those, learn from it, and detect any anomaly that would happen. Now, when it comes to suspicious events, that does not necessarily mean that a single event is considered as a suspicious event. A scenario that can be built on this particular logic would be, for example, like following. You have multiple failed logins that is followed by a successful login, and then from an unusual device, for example, and then followed by a transaction to unknown beneficiaries. This can be a scenario that started from an event but ended with a transaction, and then you suspend that transaction because of the whole logic. So there are different ways that we can utilize the event in order to detect suspicious activities.
Perfect. Thank you, Atallah. Another question, can payment guard monitor events? The answer is yes, as Atallah mentioned also. Are these requirements mandatory by SWIFT in 2022? Yes, these requirements that was shared in Atallah's presentation describes the requirements of Section 2.9 in CSP. So Section 2.9, which became mandatory in 2022, consists of 7 requirements, mandatory requirements you have to comply with. Yes, it is mandatory. And one last question. how long does it take to implement the solution? Atalla Luis.
Yeah, that I would say that implementing the solution is definitely not intimidating as it looks. For certain scope, that it will depend for sure for the scope, but in general, if we are talking about a scope like SWIFT Alliance, for example, harnessing and protection and CSP 2.9 requirements, we are not talking about an extensive time frame. Luis, please feel free, because we have been together on this for several times and through different implementations. And the scope, basically, what I would like to highlight here is the thing that determines the time frame. But in general, we are not talking about an extensive window for implementation.
Thank you, Atalla. And since that guard is already implemented at the Trustlink Service Bureau, so with the standard set of rules of CSP 2.9 rules, it's there already implemented. So it's just about a business analysis session, applying these rules on the big code of this specific bank. I think more or less we are talking about a month and a half, with including business analysis, testing, and going live. So it's straightforward because Trustlink have already implemented and invested in their service bureau to provide you with the solution. That's it from my side. These are the questions. At the end, I would like to thank you everyone for attending this webinar. I hope it was up to your expectations. For any questions, any comments on this webinar, we and Trustlink definitely with the Trustlink account managers, you can reach them and get whatever details you want. And again, there is a recording for this webinar that will be shared with all attendees of this event. So thank you very much, and looking forward to see you in future events, hopefully physical events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sami.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ahmed. Thank you, Atalla. Thanks to everyone that joined. All right. Yeah.